So of course, in this review, there will be no spoilers whatsoever. This is a completely spoiler-free review. This is a spoiler-free zone. And with that said, that's going to make this review probably the most difficult one I've ever done. Avengers Endgame is directed by Joe and Anthony Russo and stars literally everybody we have came across in the MCU thus far, and this revels in the story following Infinity War, where all of the heroes lost and 50% of all living creatures were dusted into nothingness, and now the Avengers are trying to figure out where to go next and what they're going to have to do to try and fix the situation. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is unprecedented. We have never seen anything like this in the history of film. It's so crazy to think that this whole cinematic universe started out with one movie in the form of Jon Favreau's Iron Man and has continued to grow and expand and just branch out into all these different franchises and now these big team-up movies like the Avengers, and has even led us to get some really weird obscure stuff like Guardians of the Galaxy, Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, all these really obscure comic book characters that would have never have succeeded if it wasn't for the MCU's fantastic foundations from the beginning. And 11 years later, with this movie and 22 films on, it's crazy to see how in the mainstream Marvel has become and how every person and their nan can name who an Avenger is. That is something that is an incredibly impressive feat, and I think everyone at Marvel Studios should be so proud, and it's all culminated in Avengers Endgame. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the story because, again, I want to completely avoid spoilers. The best way to go into this movie is completely blind. If I was you, I wouldn't even watch this review if you have not seen the movie yet. But the story, I actually really liked. I really appreciated the way the story went. I really appreciated how it was undertaken, how it was able to present itself. I do have some issues with the story, which I'll get onto a little bit later on. But as for the story itself, I liked it. And yes, this whole review is going to be incredibly vague, filled with moments like that, because I can't say anything. Visually, this movie is absolutely stunning as well. I would not be surprised if there was an Oscar nomination in the running for this movie, just like Infinity War was. I think that the visual effects are just fantastic in this movie. They're awesome. They really, bolster the movie. They really add to the movie. So again, just like Infinity War and pretty much every other Marvel movie out there, the visual effects are outstanding. And the action sequences are incredible in this film, as you would expect. Just like Infinity War, the scale is there, and you really feel like it. I'm not going to obviously go into specifics, but what I will say is there is a specific sequence in the final hour of the movie, in the third act, which was just incredible. It was so satisfying, so entertaining to watch, and so, again, just really, if you're a Marvel fan watching it, I wouldn't be surprised if you shed a tear watching that particular scene that I'm talking about, because I know I did. I was crying throughout the whole scene. And speaking of Marvel fans, this movie does have fan service galore. There is so much fan service in this movie, and not fan service to the point where it's kind of like, everything's forced or it's more relying on fan service than it is relying on story. It's more fan service because this is the final movie in the MCU as we know it. This is the end of the Infinity Saga. This is the end of this particular story arc in the MCU. So it's no surprise really that this film was going to play up to the fans, and it really does. Like, this movie has so many great moments. Like, if you're a Marvel fan, if you have been there from the beginning, or even if you have been there from relatively the start and you have been following these movies for years, like many of us have, you will really appreciate a lot of the incredible moments and really satisfying moments that are just coming out of this movie. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if you shed a tear. And all the characters are brilliant in this movie. All the performances are brilliant in this movie. Particularly Robert Downey Jr. I think is fantastic in this film. Chris Evans is fantastic in this film. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that Captain America gets a little bit more to do in this one than he did in Infinity War. And I think Captain America was definitely the standout here. I think he was fantastic in this movie. And again, Chris Evans really did a good job of just showing that he is Captain America. And again, Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, brilliant. Everyone else, and also other particular performances I would like to mention is Scarlett Johannson, who is of course Black Widow, and also Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk. Jeremy Renner coming back as obviously Clint Barton was great. So there's a lot of really great performance in this movie. I think overall you'll be impressed with everybody, and again in particular it's those core two Avengers. It's Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans. They really nailed this one. I do have a couple of negatives with this movie though, and again, I don't want to go too much into it for spoilers. It's really difficult to talk about this movie. This review has been so vague, but I think that the movie is a little incoherent at times. I think Infinity War you know, because a lot of people will compare this movie to Infinity War. I think in comparison to Infinity War, this movie is nowhere near as clear or concise as Infinity War was. I think that this movie has a lot of issues in being coherent. There are a lot of things that I think the movie kind of skips over. And the logic as well. Again, I'm not going to talk about the story, but there's a particular element of the story where I feel like it could have been better explained. I think there's a particular element in this film where the logic is kind of lazy, and it kind of came across to me as, okay, well, if we introduce this particular piece of logic, then we don't have to explain this other thing. Like, they kind of wrote themselves in the situation where they were basically, it was a free pass, and I thought it was a little bit lazy, and it kind of came across as a bit like, yeah, they kind of just did that so they don't have to tackle any of these particular problems that may come up. Also, some elements in this movie, particularly in the first act, I think are very rushed. And again, I'm not going to go into specifics, but I feel like there are a lot of things where I felt like, oh, that just kind of happened, and now this is happening, and there isn't really much in between those moments where you're kind of like, okay, I could have done with something there, and it kind of comes across like it's a little rushed, which is surprising given the fact that this movie is 3 hours long. But particularly in the first act, I think the first act could be a little problematic for people. I have seen that online as well. I have seen other people saying that the first act is a little slow. I don't think it's slow necessarily, but I feel like there's a lot of elements that don't particularly plan out as well as they could have done, and I feel like they came across as a little rough around the edges. Overall, though, I am completely willing to overlook all of those small little negatives for this movie because of how brilliant it is as a final product. Because when you look at this film as a culmination of 22 movies, you know, a 22 movie story arc, and you look at how it all concludes, it's incredible. Like, this is one of the most emotionally satisfying movies I have ever seen. You know, in the final hour of this movie, I was crying non-stop. Like, I was literally crying from the beginning of that final hour all the way to the end credits. Like, even during the end credits, I was crying. And just for future reference as well, if you have not seen the movie yet, there is no post-credit scene in this movie. There is no post-credit scene, so you don't have to worry about sticking around in this one. And I think when you actually see the ending of Endgame, you know, when you actually see the Endgame, you will realize that this movie didn't need a post-credit scene. And I think that, you know, as a Marvel fan, as an MCU fan, this film couldn't have been a better ending. Like, I couldn't have asked for a better ending. I adored this movie. I've seen it twice now, and I just think the movie is just so great. Like, it's so well made, and I think you really appreciate, I think with more watches, the more you will appreciate the movie. And it's one of those things where I don't think we're ever going to see a movie like this again. I don't think we're ever going to see a cinematic event like this again, because every time a big Marvel movie like this comes out, it's an event. And even though, you know, we do have Star Wars Episode 9 coming out later this year, which will also be a big event movie, I genuinely don't believe we will see anything like this in cinematic history ever again. And the fact that Marvel Studios has been able to do this and pull this off as well as they did is a huge cinematic feat, and I think that they deserve all the praise they've gotten throughout the years, because this is truly a cinematic and blockbuster-worthy masterpiece. So have you guys seen Avengers Endgame? If you have, make sure to let me know all your thoughts about it, spoiler-free, in the comment section down below. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Let's have a conversation about Endgame in the comment section down below. And as always, guys, if you want to see more movie reviews from me, be sure to subscribe, and I hope to see you guys again next time.